Well, I'm here with Professor Michael Radelet, who's in the Sociology department at the University of Colorado. Before that, had a long tenure at the University of Florida. Mike has written or edited at least 3 books on the death penalty, numerous scholarly articles, been cited by the Supreme Court and other respected tribunals. His knowledge of the death penalty is encyclopedic. He probably knows more about more aspects of capital punishment than anybody. It's not just an academic knowledge. Mike has worked closely with individuals who have been sentenced to death and some of whom have been executed. We want to talk to Mike this morning about one of his areas of expertise. Mike has also, by the way, been a tremendous supporter of the National Death Penalty Archive. He helped get some files there related to the Alvin Ford case. That was the subject of one of his books. He's donated his extensive innocence research collection to the Death Penalty Archive. He helped us get many other collections, and I did want to get Mike's thoughts today briefly about innocence and the death penalty, maybe starting with this landmark study that Mike collaborated on with the late Hugo Adam Badeau, that I'll ask Mike to overview, but basically it was very prescient in that the article was published in 1987, which was at the forefront of a lot of interest about innocence, and this anticipated many other research endeavors about innocence. And this study, Mike, maybe you can explain to us what it involved, how you and Hugo decided to take on the subject, and how you put it together.
Sure. Thanks, Jim, for that nice introduction. I started to get involved in death penalty research in 1979. I just arrived as a young assistant professor at the University of Florida, and I did my PhD at Purdue and postdoc at Wisconsin, and never took a criminology class. I was a medical sociologist teaching half-time in the medical school, and all set to go down that road for my career. But after I accepted the job at Florida, I was still in Wisconsin, they killed somebody, May 25th, 1979. And I thought, oh my God, I'm moving to a state that kills people, so I took an immediate interest in capital punishment. And the first weekend I was down in Gainesville, there was a meeting. I was riding my bike around campus, and there's a meeting of a group called Students Against the Death Penalty. I showed up. There was a woman there who had been corresponding with a death row inmate. One of his friends wanted a pen pal. So I figured, I can write. And pretty soon I started to visit him at the prison, which was only 35 miles down the road. And then a number of other death row inmates. While I visited this guy, he ended up committing suicide a couple of years later. But then I visited another guy who was executed in 1985. And after that became a paralegal, which meant that I was seeing inmates at the request of lawyers. Anyhow, with that introduction, one of the people who I knew was a guy named Bob Sullivan, who was executed in November of 1983. And Bob had this little file, little collection that he had of newspaper clippings of people convicted of homicide who turned out to be innocent. And the real pioneer here, as you mentioned, Hugo Badeau. Hugo had published a little bit of stuff on this back in the 1960s with Sarah Ehrman, who was the head of the what became the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. And Hugo came to the University of Florida in 1981 for a lecture, and that's the first time that we met. And I don't remember exactly. I think I was a little bit in over my head, but he had one of his articles published in his book, The Death Penalty in America, in 1981, had a footnote saying that he hoped to continue this research sometime in the future. So I remember writing him a letter and saying, Hugo, if you're not going to do this research, I will. And the reason I wrote that was at the request of a guy named Bob Sullivan. So I had Bob's little collection. Hugo and I said, okay, let's see if we can do something with this. We'll spend the summer doing it. And what we decided to do is collect little vignettes on people convicted of homicide who turned out to be innocent, mostly by the state's admission of error. We also included cases where people had been sentenced to death for rape and later turned out to be innocent. So all this, it's not only pre-DNA, but it was also pre-digitized copies of Supreme Court decisions or anything else. So I spent, I don't know, a couple of years, first of all, reading all the literature on wrongful convictions. There wasn't much. There were a few terrific books that had chapter-length articles, chapters on various blunders, but there was no collection of, nobody had tried to collect all the cases in one place. Excuse me. So I read all that and, started to collect information on all the cases. And what started as a summer research project ended up to be taking, 4 years, I think, 4 or 5 years. And I remember going down to the basement of the law library at the University of Florida. Of course, I knew nothing at all about legal research. I had no idea what 342 SO 2D 975 meant, whatever. But, and then after a year or so, a couple of years, I could go to the law librarian, and the law librarian could use their resources to track down some cases, but there were real limits to how much I could lean on the law librarian because I was in sociology, not in law. And it also involved an awful lot of microfilm, ordering microfilm of newspapers. We would find something like the guy, the 11th Circuit gave a guy, I guess in those days, the 11th Circuit didn't even exist. So the 5th Circuit would order a new trial for this person. We had no idea what happened to it. So I got months of microfilm and, basically scrolled through it, trying to find articles about what was going on. We did eventually get a grant for $10,000 to help with this research, but that was it. So then in, 1985, I think, we presented our preliminary findings, I think at a meeting of the ACLU, and it got picked up by a number of national news sources. We then decided to publish in a law review. This thing was so it was also the first paper that I ever word processed. To word process in those days, first of all, editing was a major challenge, but to get something printed out, you had to print it out overnight on the mainframe computer at the University of Florida. So we were doing that, and eventually we decided to send it around. And I remember a debate we had whether or not it was worth the $10 postage to mail it to Stanford Law Review. I think we sent it to 5 law reviews, with Stanford being the best. And lo and behold, they accepted it. So by that time, we were word processing on the mainframe, and the computer geeks helped me translate the format from whatever, Fortran maybe? I don't even know what language it was. And we translated into WordPerfect on a PC. I thought it was the cat's meow. And it wasn't until probably 1987 that we had access to Lexis and Westlaw to really check up on this stuff. So, the lesson here is if you don't know what you're doing, you sort of start sailing and see what you hit. Badeau was a philosopher, I'm a sociologist, and to publish, I think it was published at 160 pages. It was pretty long for a law review, even for a law review. Then, of course, after we published it, the paper was controversial, and the Attorney General was Ed Meese. and he got a couple of his people in the Justice Department to critique it. So two very bright lawyers, one is a professor now at the University of Utah, another has been on the Michigan Supreme Court for many, many years. And these were people with integrity. I met them both and become friends with both, but we disagreed on the death penalty.
Well,
So they prepared a critique, and that was published in the Stanford Law Review in 1989. Hugo and I had a little bit of a rebuttal. Their critique was basically accidents happen. Well, first of all, they said that in several of our cases, the guys really were guilty. I think we had 23 erroneous executions, but there we couldn't say the state had been in error. We simply said that we believe that most people looking at the evidence at our disposal would conclude that these people were probably guilty. Probably innocent. With the rest of our cases, almost all of them, it was the state admitted error. But anyhow, the Justice Department people said, oh, no, these guys really were guilty. And Beddoe and Radelet distorted the evidence. Then they went on to claim that the net benefits of the death penalty outweighed the liability. And most of that critique consisted of what in the 1980s was the number one pro-death penalty argument, deterrence, which today has just fallen off the cliff. Nobody's arguing deterrence anymore. So anyhow, then it got picked up. In 1991, we had the first DNA exoneration. And as that literature emerged, I remember Hugo, a very distinguished philosopher, a beard, looked like a philosopher, used big words. When we first met, I had to go get a dictionary to look up words so I could understand what he was saying. And he said, Mike, I think we were the first people exonerated by DNA because, we had written about false confessions, perjury by a prosecution witness, all this kind of stuff. And the DNA cases, as they began to emerge, had exactly the same types of errors that we had written about. So Hugo thought we were exonerated by DNA.
Well, it's a remarkable story. I mean, the study was, as I say, groundbreaking. You documented hundreds of erroneous executions in potentially capital cases. You identified, as you said, what in your view was 23 individuals who were wrongly executed. This all came out in 1987. So your study focused on the pre-modern era of the death penalty. So beginning in the mid-70s, I guess we switch into what's been called a super due process era. And what have we discovered in this new era regarding innocence and the death penalty?
Well, I think the question now is innocence is part of a larger argument about the death penalty, and that is the death penalty reserved for the worst of the worst? When we think of innocence, we think of people who legally and factually did not commit the crime. And, obviously they're not the worst of the worst, but we've got all sorts of other examples of people being sent to their deaths who were not the worst of the worst by any measure. People who have developmental disabilities, people who have long histories of abuse. As we speak now, in December of 2020, there are, right now we've already had 8 federal executions in the United States, and we've got 5 more scheduled before President Trump leaves office. But one of those people is a woman named Lisa Montgomery, not at all innocent. And you read the crime, she kidnapped a woman, cut a baby out of her uterus. She killed the woman, cut the baby out of the uterus. When you read it, anybody with half a brain is going to get sick to their stomach. But then you look at Lisa Montgomery's background. She was first raped at age 4. Her mom had, I think, 7 husbands who continually raped her, and their friends raped her. I mean, it's just a history of abuse that is equally horrible to the murder that Lisa Montgomery committed. One of my students the other day asked me if Ms. Montgomery had ever apologized for her crime, and I don't know if she has, but I know that we've not apologized for tolerating that kind of abuse. So I don't think she's, the worst of the worst. Another one of my students pointed out that with the COVID deaths, there's 270,000 deaths that could be counted as negligent homicide. It's very hard to measure who's the worst of the worst. And it's even more difficult when we are making judgments about other people. I mean, I can judge myself pretty well and recognize my own failures, but to recognize the failures of other people is a lot more difficult. And by recognizing failures of myself, we've got a history of the death penalty where, for example, between 1930 and 1967, 90% of those executed for rape were African American. And a bunch of them we've discovered based on false testimony. We see people sentenced to death because of lousy lawyers, bad luck, they turned down a plea deal, all this kind of stuff. So it's a very, very flawed system. And we run that. That's on that's on us. The homicides and the crimes are, of course, terrible, but also terrible is the way the system has been administered. So I think that, the more we know about the death penalty, the more we see these flaws, and we're not getting the worst of the worst. Again, sometimes mentally ill, developmentally disabled, people with horrible backgrounds, stuff where there's plausible arguments for innocence, and all of these wither away at the argument that the death penalty is reserved for the worst of the worst. I might say, Jim, that one of the consequences of that is that in 2020, this being December, there'll be no more executions under state authority in the United States. The only ones that are pending are federal. And we've had 8 executions this year in the United States under state authority. And that's the lowest number since Bob Sullivan was executed in 1983. So support for the death penalty, the use of the death penalty, it's dropping like a rock. Nobody would have predicted that. With, the exception is current political leadership in Washington, who there have been no federal executions for 17 years. But this year in July, before the presidential election, they decided to gear it up, for, I think, obvious political reasons to make it look like they're being tough on crime.
Mike, let me get your thoughts, and I'll not keep you much longer. But in your current home state of Colorado, the legislature repealed the death penalty statute this summer. In your former state, Florida, death penalty is ongoing. How long, in your view, until the Florida experience is going to start to wane? In other words, is the leadership that a state like Colorado is evidencing going to be localized, or are we looking at a trend where eventually states like Florida are going to go the route of Colorado? What's your thinking on that?
Well, in Colorado, it took a long time. It culminated this year, but there was an active anti-death penalty group going back to the first post-Furman statute in the 1970s. There's always a vocal criticism, and the death penalty was really, people were split on it going back in our history, but it took a long time, a lot of different groups, lawyers, religious people, activists, all this working together. Those seeds are in the ground in Florida already, and Florida's got a worse record in applying the death penalty and getting the worst of the worst than almost any other state. They lead the country in the number of people post-Furman who have been convicted of homicide and turned out to be innocent. I mean, they had blunders left and right. There's huge race of victim disparities in who's sentenced to death in Florida. And they've got a pretty bright group of not only activists, but lawyers. Unfortunately, their politicians, I think they're the worst in the country. I mean, when I left, the governor was Jeb Bush, and Jeb Bush today is looking like a pretty, moderate, maybe even a liberal, compared to the political leaders that they've got now. So these things swing back and forth. There have been other political leaders in Florida who were pro-death penalty, but I think given the chance to repent, they might be against it today. I'm thinking specifically of Governor Bob Graham, who presided over bunches of executions when he was governor in the early 80s. It's very possible that in his heart, he now realizes the death penalty is wrong. So these things can turn pretty quickly. Florida has got a number of other issues. Felon disenfranchisement is a big one, but I'm optimistic that within the next, I don't know, maybe not, certainly not the next 5 years, but within the next 15 or 20 years, we're going to see dramatic decrease in the number of death sentences in Florida, which we already see, but also a decrease in the number of executions. California is the state that's going to set the trend. They've got the largest death row in the country, something like 725 people on death row. But Governor Newsom has imposed a moratorium, and it's complicated how they can do this, but it's possible that every death sentence will be commuted to life without parole.
Well, Mike, thank you. Thank you for your support of the National Death Penalty Archive. Again, many of your papers are there, and scholars, public have access to those papers. We'll keep trying to collect more materials about the history and current state of the death penalty, put them in the archive. And we really appreciate your help over the years. And thanks for the opportunity to talk with you.
Well, Jim, it's we the death penalty scholars who should be thanking you, because without that archive, the papers would go in the recycle bin. And you and your colleagues in the archives at Albany have just done a magnificent job of assembling the best collection in the world for death penalty material. And it's not only useful today, but it'll be useful to future generations when we look back on the death penalty today, the way that we look back on slavery in the 17th and 18th and 19th, even 19th century. So thank you for what you do.